Great. Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks for painting that picture of what it's like in the room. And I'm just really delighted to be here today. Since I can't see you, of course, interrupt me at any time if you can't hear or something seems amiss. I'm going to try to share my screen here, and you can just let me know if you see the slide or also the notes.
Perfect.
Okay, great, wonderful. As you just said, Alex, I'm gonna in some ways think about today as a way to kind of take stock of where we are in the field of refugee education, but also really to try to think forward about how we envision the future and the kind of work that many of you in the room and that I are engaged with. I'm going to talk for 30 to 40 minutes about some of what I've learned through this new book, Right Where We Belong, and then really looking forward to the discussion. I see we have a chat here, but there's also people in the room, so please just hold on to questions as they occur to you through the time. In the center of the screen here is the question that really drives this book and that drives much of my work. This idea of what it would take to ensure that all displaced young people have access to learning that enables them to feel a sense of belonging and prepares them to help build more peaceful and equitable futures. I think particularly coming from a school of education, a really applied kind of field, we think a lot about these ideas of kind of what would it take, of thinking not only about the research, but also the direct links to policy and practice, in this case, in schools and with teachers and students. These are the topic areas in the quadrants that the book addresses and the research that it draws from. I tried to do something a little different with this book, bringing together 9 research studies, including 15 years of ethnographic research in schools and interviews with more than 600 people in 23 countries. I'm going to begin with some context, particularly around education, because I know not all of us are coming from the field of education, and how I hope some of what I think we learn from refugee teachers and students can shift this field of refugee education that address some of the ongoing and rampant inequities that we see, as well as expand opportunities for refugee young people. Today, about 58 million children remain out of school globally, typically, not with short-term shutdowns, but have lack of access to school. And this actually represents massive progress, down from about 99 million in 2000. But it also hides who is really left out. So we know that most of the children globally who still do not have access to education live in conflict and displacement. In terms of learning, we know that there are massive inequities globally in even access to foundational reading and numeracy skills. Some of the work that we've done in Kenya has documented early grade literacy outcomes, so children between kind of ages 6 and 8, among refugees to be really the lowest in the world. And I'll talk today about some of the ways in which refugees experience exclusion in schools, from languages, from curricula, and from relationships with teachers and with peers. Access to education and to learning, in theory, enables opportunity. But of course, we know that opportunities, educational and otherwise, are tied to structures, including the legal, social, political, and economic conditions in a host country, and also to power. In almost all settings where refugees live, so I'm having trouble with my slides here, let's see if it goes. In almost all countries where refugees live, as is very familiar to those of you working in this field directly, even if not in education, refugees are non-citizens and likely never citizens. And in particular, as related to education, these conditions really limit access to educational opportunities in the present, and also to post-schooling opportunities and to the way that young people imagine those opportunities, especially with limited rights to education, but also to work, capital, and to long-term residence. Some of you are very familiar with setting in refugee schools, but I know that some are not. And I think it's really important to see people and not just words on a screen in these kinds of discussions. Any of the photos that I'm sharing today were taken and they're shared with permission. This is a typical classroom in a refugee camp in terms of the number of students and the infrastructure. 30% or so of refugees globally live in Africa, And this is a standard one. So really the first year of school in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya in 2018. But of course, there's wide variation in how and where refugee children go to school globally. More than 60% of refugees live in cities, and this is a refugee education classroom in a city. It's a grade 9 class of Syrian students in Beirut, Lebanon in 2019. This graph is pretty outdated, but we think about the number of refugees globally and the fact that it is growing day by day. And also, as we think about education in particular, how this will shift with climate change and political instability globally, even if not flight across borders, the kind of disruption that this causes for education. Importantly, where refugees live is not distributed equitably globally. I really like this map. I showed it to a class of 5th graders the other day, and they immediately kind of got it. So we see in this map the relative percentage of refugees globally. 86% of refugees living in countries classified as low and middle income countries, which really matters for education because in these countries, there are fewer resources for social services such as education across the board. So national students are also struggling. For comparison, I think about this in terms of classrooms. Again, in 2017, 25% of the population in Lebanon was a refugee compared to 0.1% in the US where I now live. And again, if we think about this in terms of classrooms, of course, this is not the way classrooms are distributed across countries, but imagining our own children sitting in classrooms where 1 in 4 students might have had disrupted education, maybe learning in a new language, may have come from a situation of violence, very prevalent in a place like Lebanon and almost non-existent in a place like the United States. If we think about kind of the numbers also, I was looking back to see how many refugees from Afghanistan were admitted to the US in 2019, and it was about 1,100. Almost 1.5 million Afghans at that time continued to live in Pakistan. And I say this continued because I think this long-term displacement is another essential dimension, of course, of refugee experiences broadly, but also of education. So while these numbers are debated and there's many ways to look at them, in general, once displaced, 80% of refugees are displaced for at least 5 years and 20% for over 20 years. This length of displacement for kids and for education means that any experience of refuge, of forced migration, is really that child's one shot at education. If we think about the number of years that pass and that window of opportunity for being in school and for learning. I think back to Abrun, who was one of our research participants in Kenya, who arrived in Kenya thinking he would quickly return to Somalia after he fled with his family. But 21 years later, he was still in Kenya, not only having gone through his whole education, but now as a teacher in schools in Kenya. So this expectation of short-term displacement, but the reality of long-term displacement, present not only for agencies making refugee policies, but also for individual refugees as they think about their education and about their futures. These dilemmas of access, of learning, and of opportunity, the geographies of where refugees live, and this long-term, often lifetime displacement, certainly school time displacement, present urgent sets of policy and practice challenges in the field of education. Typically in global education research and policy, access, learning, and opportunity are really conceptualized as a kind of sequential and linear model. This idea that with access comes learning, with learning comes opportunity. But I hope that this book contributes to the research of many in the field of education that shows how we really need to think about these three in integrated ways, since many of the challenges of policy and practice are really rooted in the way we conceptualize how they link together. Exploring these relationships among access, among learning, and among opportunity was one motivation for me in writing this book. Another motivation was that I felt the need for work that wasn't bounded by the very same country borders that often cause conflict in the first place. I wanted my work to reflect this essential idea that we learn from refugee young people that they are living transnational lives in reality and in aspiration, and that movement across these places is key to understanding their educational experiences, their learning experiences. This map, which I know is hard to see on the screen, represents the context that I address in the book, including the 9 studies that I mentioned before. A third motivation for writing this book was that I hope it would develop the possibilities, open the possibilities for developing concepts that really link across time, across place, and across ideas, in order to point research policy and practice in new and productive directions, not only in the field of education, but also really considering the dimensions of power and politics in each context that could support us to act on the inequalities that we observe in access to education, in learning, in order to expand opportunities. In particular, what I had been seeing over the course of many years of this work and wanted to explore was how education can link together the histories and identities that young people bring to schools, the experiences that they have daily in schools in the present, and the kind of future building that they hope education helps them to engage in. Not each of these past, present, future separate, which is often how policies are thought about, but constantly linked together. So if we come back to this slide, I hope we can see some of the interrelationships across these dilemmas across the arc of the book. As a kind of summary, what I see is that out of the history of refugee education, we emerge right now in a moment where most, but not all, refugees have new access to national schools. And yet in studying the purposes of education for refugees and how they're understood across country contexts, we see multiple models of schooling and challenges in how access to national schools doesn't typically translate into learning for refugee students. Access is, of course, necessary, but it's not sufficient. As I began then to look closely at the kinds of resources that could support learning and belonging for refugee students, our research revealed previously undocumented transnational educational relationships that really shape what and how refugee young people learn. Out of this work have come new questions about how access and learning connect to opportunities for young people to build their futures in settings of massive restrictions on their economic, social, and political rights, and new findings on how students and teachers navigate these inequities in order to expand opportunity. I discuss in the book how I think these types of reformulations come both through the substance of the research that we do, but also how we do it, the methods that we use, and the kind of conceptual interdisciplinary work that we do across fields. I'm very happy to talk more about the methods in the discussion, but I'm going to focus more on the substantive reformulations of thinking in refugee education for the rest of the presentation. When I began my research in this field, alongside some of you I know who are gathered today, the really prevailing view among global and national organizations and in early, mostly agency-conducted research was that education for refugees was a kind of holding ground, really designed to create a more stable present, but to defer the creation of a future. Most refugees had access to education only in separate schools for refugees, isolated from national education systems, and with the clear intention of providing temporary schooling with short-term goals. I was really struck by how little this approach aligned with both the long-term nature of displacement and also the kinds of education I observed refugee communities creating for their children in terms of building connections to national education systems and to purposes aligned to futures they imagined, both in the context of politics and conflict in their home country and also their host countries, clearly oriented towards long-term goals. In the book, I examine the history of refugee education to try to understand how we got to the place that we are now, which is an era I call nationalization, where by policy, refugees have access to national education systems. This kind of radical shift in global policy to integrate refugees into national education systems led me to questions about the purposes of education. This movement to include refugees in national education systems, I came to realize, really rested on the idea that inclusion could address refugees' unknowable futures, in order to provide the kind of educational stability and quality that was needed in long-term displacement within already existing national systems. That line of thinking followed from the idea that the purposes of education within national education systems would, or at least could, align for refugees and for nationals. But what we have found is not one, but multiple models of inclusion of refugees in national education systems. I'm going to show a typology now that derives from work that we did around 2018. There have been some shifts, but not major ones in these kind of models of education. So really, first, there is a model of no inclusion, such as is prevalent in Malaysia and Bangladesh, where refugees have no legal status and no right to education. Refugees' futures are presumed to be elsewhere in terms of resettlement or return from the very moment of arrival. And thus, in these situations, only non-formal schooling is permitted. This is just also a snapshot of countries because this was a 14-country study. The second and third models that we find are inclusion in this, what we call the structural elements of education, like access to school buildings, host country curriculum, languages of instruction, and certification, but in separate spaces. So this can be geographic segregation in camps, like in Kenya, in Uganda, and Ethiopia, or a temporal segregation in separate shifts. So like in Lebanon, where Lebanese students go to school in the morning, and Syrian students go to school in the afternoon in the same school building with many of the same school teachers. There's a fourth model of inclusion where refugees and nationals study together in the same schools at the same time. And we find this really only in an ad hoc way, and particularly in some cities. In all of these latter three models of inclusion, geographic segregation, temporal segregation, and inclusion together with nationals, we find that this inclusion is really framed largely as a pragmatic solution to providing education for refugees and understood to prepare refugees with skills that could eventually support their futures, but not futures in the host country, instead as elsewhere. We find these models actually reflect the purposes of education for refugees that diverge from purposes for nationals. In particular, that they align with these futures that policymakers and many teachers envision for refugees, that future being elsewhere, somewhere outside the place where they are being educated. So overall, we find evidence under this new model of inclusion of structural integration, making national education available to refugee young people, but little attention to the relational integration processes that are essential for learning, for belonging, and for opportunity. In schools and classrooms, what this means is that teachers and students feel a lack of alignment with what they think inclusion in national schools means and what they actually experience. Along these lines, before I get into the third part of the findings of the book, I wanted to tell you about Annette, who's a participant in one of our research studies and also a protagonist in the book. This is actually a drawing that she made that you see on the screen. When Annette arrived in Uganda, she thought that her exile in the Chakatu refugee settlement would be short-lived. This was about 20 years ago at this point, and that she would soon return to her home in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. But one day she described to me looking through the cloth that made the door to her family's home in the camp, and she noticed that her father had planted bananas. And she knew something about bananas. She knew that they would not yield fruit the first year that they were planted. And she also knew that he never would have planted them if he, like she, expected the family to soon return home. In her school in the Chaka refugee settlement, Annette sat at the back of a class of 49 children. She was never called on to speak in class. I spent about 3 years off and on in her classroom. Her teachers rarely had the chance to look at her exercise books, and she never interacted with her teachers outside of the classroom either. She described in great detail how the national students refused to sit with refugees in these schools. Nationals sat 2 to a bench and refugees sat 4 to a bench. And the kids knew that they couldn't move to even out these numbers. That would just not be acceptable. Yet, despite what the children experienced in this kind of discrimination and segregation, a Ugandan NGO worker in the camp explained to me the rationale for not collecting data on ethnicity within the camp. When they come here, she said, we ask them not to be their nationalities anymore. Instead, each day, Annette stood in front of the Ugandan flag in the school's compound. You can see on the drawing the flag that she drew right in the middle of the page. And she drew the flag and then told me about how she felt about the flag and standing there to sing the song. She said she sang the anthem every morning. Oh, Uganda, the land of freedom. Oh, Uganda, the land that feeds us. I'd watched Annette every day sing loudly when she arrived at this line. We lay our future in thy hand. But as she described, as she laid her faith, her future in the hands of the country, she soon came to realize that her future could not be of that country. For the next 5 years after I met her, Annette continued to go to school every day. When she stopped at age 18, she wasn't allowed to vote. She wasn't allowed to own property. She didn't have the right to work. And instead, even many years later, she's lived in the same refugee camp and continued to be a subsistence farmer. These kinds of examples have really posed to me two questions that I think are essential to think through as we think about the future of this field. The first is really, what is the value of including refugees in schools that are already failing national students? And even in a best case scenario where refugees are able to access high quality education within national education systems, what are these kind of unequal opportunity structures that limit their futures? What I describe, so kind of back to this before we get to the learning, resources for learning and belonging, I think this really is the next kind of set of questions. If we think about the ways in which access is necessary but not sufficient, what are the possibilities for learning and belonging towards opportunity? The real next stage of thinking about education, not just as this holding ground that defers the future, but actually something, as any of us who have had this privilege to experience education know, of thinking about education as an enabler of futures. What I describe in the book, I think, counters two prevailing ideas that have been present within the field of refugee education. First, that refugees are reliant on international humanitarian aid structures for their educational success. And second, that few educational supports are accessible in refugee communities. This narrative is present across the world in terms of thinking about under-resourced and marginalized communities. We also document in the book ties between diaspora and their country of origin, a kind of transnational movement, not just of monetary resources, but of educational resources. We find that refugee students draw on both locally and globally situated resources for their education through these kinds of transnational relationships, particularly with former teachers. We also find that these transnational relationships actually shift what refugees learn. In education, a really prominent framework for thinking is an ecological system developed by Uri Bronfenbrenner. So this idea that the microsystem, the individual, is connected then to the family and community, to policies, regional, national, and global, and to systems of values and norms, as well as a chronosystem that extends over time. And as we began to think about this model, we realized that refugees were showing us ways in which it needs to be reformulated to account for current day phenomenon of migration and communication, which means that very intimate and consistent and daily relationships, such as those among families and teachers and peers, not only happen face-to-face, but also happen virtually as well, connecting resources and capital across places. In the book, I emphasize the value not only of material resources, which has often been the focus of humanitarian assistance in education, but also the substance of learning and what that learning means both now and for the future. These emerging patterns, in particular how teachers and community leaders with refugee backgrounds themselves not only provide resources, but also re-envision what and how refugee children learn, led to more conceptual thinking about the ways in which refugee education could actually act on the inequalities that we observe in access and in learning in order to expand opportunities. Long-term work in many places documented in this book and in the broader field of refugee studies shows that refugees' experiences of forced displacement and migration result in a kind of constant navigation of this triangle. As we think about it in schools, connecting histories to this dual imperative to live both in the place one is hosted from the very moment of arrival, this idea of placemaking, while also connecting that placemaking to future building. Future building involving imagining and planning for multiple possible futures, which might be here, which might be there, which might be somewhere as yet unknowable. Processes that aren't linear or really seeking some arrived at geographic state. But of course, there are massive legal, policy, and xenophobic constraints on refugees' access to resources and to opportunities, both for placemaking and for future building. At the same time, what I'm constantly struck by is how refugee young people and their families describe how education supports them in navigating this triangle and also the barriers that stand in the way, particularly the misalignments between schooling in the present and opportunities in the future. I want to situate this thinking about navigation among past, present, and future in a few conceptual ideas that I've been inspired in collaborative thinking with many colleagues. One is related to negative and positive peace. So Johan Galtung, drawing on earlier work of Martin Luther King Jr., describes the difference between negative peace, the absence of direct violence, and positive peace, the absence of structural violence. So positive peace being not only the absence of violence, but the presence of conditions that allows individuals to access equal opportunities. I argue in the book that refugee education has typically been framed with the goal of negative peace. I think we see this in historical work with refugee education as a kind of temporary holding ground to keep people safe until some imagined return is possible, but also more recently in different models of inclusion of refugees in national education systems that support access, but without accompanying conditions for learning, for belonging, and for this access to equal opportunities. The social theorist Nancy Fraser also outlines how access to equal opportunities requires redistribution to counter resource-based inequalities and recognition to counter identity-based inequalities. What we see in the field of education is that redistribution to address resource-based inequalities can often happen through systems-level policies, as we see in the case of policies to include refugees in national education systems. But as we see in growing work in the field of refugee education, addressing identity-based inequalities can be much more challenging to do at scale, to institutionalize, especially in settings where refugees do not have rights and the national narratives of belonging that pervade school curriculum and teaching simply don't include them. I began to ask if disrupting identity-based inequalities could be compatible with the inclusion model of refugee education. What I find in the book is that possibilities of disrupting these inequalities are really connected to perceptions of refugees' futures. From research with refugee students across contexts, we see that they largely reject the notion that they can conceptualize their futures geographically and in terms of countries. But of course, this is how migration policies are conceptualized. What I've learned from young people is that, of course, they're wishing for more geographic certainty and more inclusive migration policies are essential. They also pragmatically really think through how little control they have over these kinds of migration policies and start to conceptualize their futures in different ways in terms of opportunities, which really shapes the purposes and experiences of education. So this means the capacity to apply what one learns, not just in one particular place, but across place and across time, not having to choose between the present and the future, between the kinds of learning that may be deemed worthy in the place where one is at any particular moment, and the opportunities that that might trade away for a different, reimagined, unknowable kind of future. This framework, I think, relies less on education as bounded by geography and more on education as an enabler of opportunity, a kind of shift away from a narrow focus on negative peace and resources as the only framework for thinking and action, with a new focus on identifying mechanisms by which refugee education can act on both resource and identity-based inequalities to work towards positive peace, including equitable opportunities. There's a kind of optimism in these ideas that I think runs quite counter to most of what is written about refugees. But I share this optimism because I find it derives from the people who do the work of refugee education daily, of teachers and young people. I find that their optimism isn't based in ignoring reality, but instead in being so deeply engaged with it. This experience of inequality at every turn really means that considering replicating the status quo is no option at all. I think to live up to these goals and to this optimism as a field, we still have a long way to go. And I talk about some of the openings of opportunity to do this in the book. I'm just going to show very briefly one example of how teachers are mitigating these kinds of inequities. And this is based on a recent study in Lebanon that we did, which included 101 classroom observations and 54 interviews, life history interviews with young people. The drawings that I'm going to show here were part of this work. You can see here the actual picture and the drawing really representing the research in this graphic design, and as a way to reach more public audiences. This work was done in collaboration with Positive Negatives and with the Syrian artist Sasso Nourallah. So this is an example of what happened in a school one day. Two Syrian students arrived to school in the afternoon shift to find a poster that they had made ripped up and torn to pieces on the floor. The students, Munir and Mira, tried to talk to their teacher about what had happened. And by way of explanation, the teacher said that the Lebanese students in the morning shift felt like Munir, Mira, and their friends were intruders on the school. This idea made Munir even more upset, and he said he wanted to rip all of their work. It seemed only to make it worse when the principal then told the class that maybe the Lebanese students did this to the poster because, after all, it is their school first. Munir, upset as he was also resigned in some ways to this second-class status. As Mira said, it did make some sense. They're Lebanese and their school is Lebanese. For sure. There's no country that favors others over their own citizens, right? In Syria, we also have our own school, and it's not theirs. Munir explained how this felt to him. It's like they're giving the school to us so we can learn, but not to be established. While he felt this way, he most often found these conversations closed for discussion, with his teachers saying things in response like, "Don't interfere with politics. We're here to study, not to talk about these issues." With this kind of example in mind, I wanted to briefly come back to this triangle and the kinds of gaps in the ways in which education can support young people in connecting histories, placemaking, and future building. As Munir described in this example, his education involved trade-offs, learning now, but with the impossibility of being established. So we come to ask in our newer work what possibilities there are for positive peace when refugees are included within national education systems, but also marginalized from these experiences of belonging and of opportunity. And we find that young people attribute major roles to their teachers in developing the kind of capacities that support them in connecting past, present, and future, not just the aspiration that education could support multiple possible futures, but actually concrete ways in which this happens to shift the focus from geography to opportunity. So Syrian young people describe the structures and content of schooling as barriers, but they connect teacher pedagogies and school relationships to these capacities to connect past, present, and future, which do begin to enable belonging and opportunity. The structures of schooling, for an example, were a constant experience of being behind, having lost time in school because of the war, having a hard time catching up with language, and literally coming to school later than behind Lebanese students every day. Compounding this feeling of being behind was the feeling of being intentionally kept separate from Lebanese students in this temporal segregation. So the structures actually set up a feeling of being unwanted. For context, overall, across all the work, refugee students describe how they feel left out of curriculum, not just in Lebanon, but globally, of curriculum that doesn't pertain to them. So for example, in a civics lesson on respecting public servants, a Syrian student raised that his father had faced insults when trying to renew the family's residency permit. The student questioned whether public servants always warranted respect. The civics teacher smiled sheepishly at that moment. The bell rang, marking not just the end of the period, but also implicitly communicating that there was little time to bring personal experiences into a formal curriculum that was disconnected from students' lives. Students found that effective teachers, on the other hand, supported them to overcome these fixed structures and content of schooling through some pedagogical approaches, especially those that enabled them to make sense of the disconnects in their experiences being included in Lebanese national education, but excluded from the curriculum they were learning. One student shared how her civics teacher motivated students to become part of society, to have greater importance and not just be on the margins. The teacher reminded them that with civics, they might be able to change other people's perspectives. But then acknowledging the dissonance between this optimism for students as agents of change and their limited power as refugees and as students, the student recalled how this teacher admitted that in the end, nothing of what's in this lesson exists. We wish it does. But the teacher went on, encouraging students about the future. It's true you're learning things that don't exist, but you might be the reason they exist in the future. You might do things related to politics, and you can change and do the things that you study about. Students connected opportunities for these pedagogies to their relationships with teachers, especially ones based in respect, care, trust, support, and open communication. They described how these relationships support them explicitly in reconciling the current placemaking in this fixed geography of Lebanon and the future building focused on what they hope would be less confined opportunity. In important ways, these relationships are about making them feel welcome. As one student said, the teachers didn't at all make us feel that we were entering a country that isn't ours. Students valued relationships in which you feel like someone's listening to you. In our data, we see refugee students value teachers who use relationships as the foundation of their teaching and support students to navigate the fixed content and structures of schooling by way of these pedagogies and relationships. In our new work, we call this relational pedagogy in refugee education pedagogies of belonging. And we find that refugee young people describe them as important to seeking to build their futures, unknowable as these futures continue to be, in small and incremental ways. Again, not really institutionalized, and this is a big question, but to shift the focus from geography to opportunity. We're continuing to explore some of these big questions about how teachers learn these pedagogies, how they could be institutionalized, the kinds of institutional conditions that enable them, as well as the long-term trajectories of refugee students. I'm excited about our discussion together and the kind of ongoing collaborations that I see in this field that I think can help build greater understanding of the processes that can enable learning and belonging for refugee young people, and how we also might redesign our policies and institutions to reflect these goals. With thanks to so many in this work and really looking forward to discussion.